Struggling to save his farm during the worst winter in years, Daniel Hayes never expected that feeding a stranger's shivering horse in a blizzard would lead to a second chance at life and love with a woman who had everything but trust. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? I'd love to know. The wind cut through the valley like a blade, sharp and merciless, rattling the rusted tin roof of Daniel Hayes' weather-worn barn. He stood at the edge of the hayloft, boots crunching over scattered straw, his calloused hands gripping the last bale of hay like it weighed more than it should. Below, his old mare, Ruby, nickered softly, shifting her weight in the chill. She was thin, too thin, they all were. Daniel tossed the bale down, watching it break apart as it hit the frozen ground. Ruby ambled over and nudged at the hay with her muzzle, grateful even before the first bite. The other horses followed, quieter than usual, their breath rising in white plumes. He wiped his hands on his jeans, feeling the silence settle in again. The barn was still, save for the shuffling of hooves and the distant groan of the wind pressing against the walls. It used to be full here. Animals, laughter, life. That was before. Before the prices dropped, before the drought, before Maggie. Daniel stepped outside, pulling his coat tighter. The house loomed a short distance away, peeling paint and shuttered windows, making it look like it was holding its breath. He glanced at it, then down the long stretch of dirt road that led nowhere and everywhere. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations, land worked by hands that bled for it, built on sweat and stubbornness. But banks didn't care about legacy, deadlines didn't care about good intentions, and hay bales didn't multiply on their own. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard into the cold. Tomorrow, the man from the bank would come again. Same suit, same fake sympathy. The offer on the table was laughable, but Daniel wasn't laughing anymore. From inside the house, a faint light flickered on. Emily must be up. 7 years old and already carrying more weight than she should. Daniel turned toward the house, the crunch of his boots slow and heavy. There were still mouths to feed, school lunches to pack, boots to mend. But for now, the animals had eaten. That was something. Maybe not enough, but it was something. The air had changed. Daniel felt it before he saw it, an eerie stillness that settled over the land like a held breath. The sky, once a dull winter gray, had deepened to the color of iron. Heavy clouds stacked on the horizon like waves ready to crash. Somewhere in the distance, a single crow called, then silence. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching in the brittle frost, and looked west. A snowstorm was coming. Not the kind you cursed under your breath and shoveled through with gritted teeth. No, this was the kind that swallowed roads, broke trees, and turned forgotten farms into ghost stories. Daniel hurried to the barn, his breath sharp in his lungs. He needed to brace the outer doors, seal the gaps in the windows, double-check the generator. The animals, his few remaining cows, the chickens, Ruby and the 2 other horses, needed shelter, needed warmth. He wasn't sure if he could give them either, not anymore. Inside, the barn felt colder than usual. He pulled the wool blanket tighter over Ruby's back and gave her muzzle a gentle stroke. "It's going to be a rough one, girl," he murmured. She blinked slowly, as if she already knew. The radio in the tack room crackled to life, an old emergency broadcast squawk repeating the same message. Severe conditions expected, travel not advised, temperatures dropping rapidly. Daniel turned the dial down. He didn't need the warning. He could feel it in his bones. By the time he finished reinforcing the barn, snow had started falling in slow, deliberate flakes, the kind that stick, the kind that build. He looked back toward the house where a single light glowed in the kitchen window. Emily. She'd be coloring at the table, probably humming under her breath, waiting for him to come in and heat up the leftover stew. He paused at the edge of the porch, watching the snow gather on the steps. The storm was going to be bad, maybe the worst in years. And with no more hay, a dwindling propane tank, and bills stacked on the counter inside, he didn't know how much more he had to give. But the farm still stood. The animals were sheltered. Emily was safe. For tonight, that would have to be enough. The snow had thickened to a curtain, heavy and relentless, blurring the horizon into a shapeless wall of white. Daniel squinted through the frost-laced window, the world beyond his porch now little more than ghostly outlines. The wind howled across the fields like a warning, rattling the windows with icy fingers. It was the kind of storm you stayed inside for, the kind that made you grateful for every nail in your roof and every log stacked by the stove. He was reaching for his coat to check the barn one last time when something caught his eye. At first it didn't look real, just a dark smear moving through the whiteness. But as the shadow came closer, the shape began to sharpen. A figure atop a horse, slow-moving and hunched against the wind. The animal stumbled slightly, its legs pushing through snow already past the fetlocks. The rider leaned low over the neck, cloaked in layers, but visibly trembling, a silhouette fighting both nature and time. Daniel's breath hitched. What kind of fool was out riding in this storm? He yanked the door open, the cold slamming into him like a wall. Snow bit at his face as he stepped out onto the porch, boots sinking with each step. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted into the wind, "Hey, over here!" The rider didn't respond, but the horse veered toward the sound, hooves slipping in the ice. Daniel moved fast, cutting across the yard toward the gate, heart thudding. Up close the scene was worse. The horse was lathered with sweat and flecked with ice, steam rising off its back, its sides heaved with effort. The rider, small, bundled, barely upright, swayed in the saddle. "Whoa, whoa there," Daniel murmured to the horse, grabbing the reins and steadying the animal. He looked up just in time to catch the rider as she slumped forward, nearly falling off. He reached out, pulling her down into the snowbank as gently as he could. Her hood fell back just enough to reveal a pale, flushed face framed by wet strands of dark hair. Eyes half-lidded, lips blue. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, lifting her up as the wind howled louder. "Let's get you inside," he muttered, not yet knowing her name, not yet knowing how this moment would change everything. The woman was barely conscious in his arms, her body limp with cold, but Daniel's instincts kicked in like muscle memory. He carried her quickly across the yard, snow swirling around them in a blinding frenzy, and nudged open the front door with his shoulder. The warmth of the wood stove hit him like a wall, and he laid her gently on the worn couch, pulling an old quilt from the back and wrapping it around her trembling frame. "Emily!" he called, not loudly. He didn't want to scare her, but enough to get her attention. His daughter appeared from the hallway, eyes wide at the sight of the stranger. "Is she okay?" "She's freezing. I need you to stay with her. Keep the blanket tight around her. I'll be right back." He brushed a hand over Emily's head and was gone before she could ask more questions. Back outside, the cold slapped him again, even crueler now after the brief warmth of home. The horse stood exactly where he'd left it, head low, flanks quivering with exhaustion. Daniel could see the animal's ribs beneath the damp coat, its breath fogging heavily in the air. The reins had slipped from the saddle, dragging in the snow. He whispered softly as he approached, "Easy, girl. You've had a hell of a ride, huh?" The horse didn't resist when he led her toward the barn, though every step seemed to cost her. Daniel opened the side door and led her inside, guiding her gently to an empty stall. It had once been home to his best quarter horse, before the vet bills and feed costs made choices for him. He stripped off the wet tack, rubbing the horse down with an old burlap sack. He tossed the last of the straw into the stall, spreading it out with his boot, then filled the trough with the final scoop of oats from a bag he'd meant to stretch through the week. "Don't say I never did anything for royalty," he murmured, as the horse dipped her nose into the feed. Daniel leaned against the stall door, watching her breathe easier now, her muscles relaxing with every bite. He should have felt the pinch of dwindling supplies, the pressure of one more mouth to feed, but right now it didn't matter. The horse had come through the storm, The woman was safe inside. For tonight, that was enough. By the time Daniel returned to the house, his coat was stiff with ice, and his fingers burned with the sting of returning warmth. He stepped into the front room, boots heavy on the wooden floor, and was met with the quiet crackle of the stove and the soft creak of the couch. She was awake now. The woman sat upright, the quilt draped over her shoulders like a shawl, steam rising faintly from her damp clothes. Her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and a startling shade of gray-blue, met his the moment he stepped inside. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Daniel removed his gloves and crossed to her slowly. "You're lucky," he said, voice even. "That storm would have turned you into a ghost if I hadn't seen you when I did." She gave the faintest smile. "I was starting to wonder if I already was one." Emily sat nearby, curled up in the armchair, clutching a mug of hot chocolate between her hands. She looked at the woman with open curiosity, eyes flicking between her and Daniel, like she was trying to piece together a story without the words. "I'm Daniel," he said, setting a steaming cup of tea on the table beside the woman. "My daughter's Emily." The woman accepted the cup with a small nod. "Kate." "Just Kate?" he asked gently, eyebrows lifting. She glanced away, a flicker of something, hesitation maybe, passing over her features. "For now," she replied. Daniel didn't push. He wasn't the prying kind, but he couldn't help noticing the quality of her clothes. The boots were designer, worn but unmistakably expensive. The coat beneath the quilt was tailored and lined with fur. And that horse. No one in their right mind rode a purebred warmblood through a snowstorm unless they were running from something or toward it. "You from around here?" he asked. Kate shook her head. "Passing through." "On horseback?" "It wasn't the plan," she admitted, then took a sip of the tea. "The car died. The stable was farther than I thought. I took the horse and hoped for the best." Daniel studied her for a long moment. She didn't look fragile, but she looked tired. The kind of tired that came from running too long, too far. "Well," he said, finally breaking the silence, "you made it, and you're safe now." She met his eyes again, and this time the guardedness slipped just a little. "Thanks to you." The storm howled against the windows like a living thing, but inside the Hayes house, warmth had carved out a fragile peace. The fire in the stove crackled low, casting golden light across the faded rug and wood-paneled walls. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it held a kind of comfort that couldn't be bought. It was lived in, real. Daniel ladled soup from the dented pot on the stove into a mismatched bowl and set it in front of Kate. Steam curled into the air, thick with the scent of carrots, potatoes, and the last bits of chicken he'd had in the freezer. She cupped the bowl in her hands like it was the most precious thing she'd ever held. "You didn't have to," she murmured. "You didn't have to ride through a snowstorm," Daniel said, his tone dry but not unkind. "I figure we're both doing things we didn't plan on tonight." She gave a small smile, tight, tired, but genuine, and took a careful sip. Her eyes fluttered closed for a heartbeat as the warmth spread through her. Across the room, Emily perched cross-legged on the couch, a blanket around her shoulders and a book open on her lap, though she kept sneaking glances at their guest. "You feeling warmer?" Daniel asked, sliding into the chair across from her. Kate nodded. "I think my fingers work again." "That's a start." She didn't say much after that, and Daniel didn't press. He knew the kind of silence that came from exhaustion, from carrying more than you could explain. He let her eat in peace. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, the patched wallpaper, the cracked lamp, the old family photo on the mantel of a younger Daniel with a woman beside him and a baby in his arms. "This place," she said softly, "it's honest." Daniel blinked. "Not a word I hear often." "I mean it." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "It feels like it means something, like it matters." "It does," he said simply. And for a long while they sat without speaking, just the fire, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, and the quiet understanding that sometimes kindness didn't need conversation to be felt. The storm pressed in harder as the night deepened, burying the house in a hush so complete it made every creak of the old wood floors feel louder. Snow pelted the windows in thick waves, the wind keening like a warning from the dark. Power flickered once, then held steady, the generator humming faintly from the shed out back, barely enough to keep the lights and the stove going. Daniel had offered her Emily's room without hesitation. Emily, wide-eyed and quietly excited by the presence of their mysterious guest, had insisted on making a blanket fort in the living room instead. She was already curled up beneath it, fast asleep with a flashlight and her stuffed bear tucked close to her chest. Kate stood at the edge of the hallway, one of Emily's old sweatshirts draped over her, too big, sleeves bunched at the wrists, but dry. Her riding clothes hung over a chair by the stove, damp and stiff from the cold. She looked less like the stranger from the snow and more like someone who belonged, even if she didn't know it yet. Daniel poured 2 mugs of tea and handed one to her. No whiskey to spike it with, I'm afraid. Tea's fine, she said, taking the mug with both hands. Better than anything I've had in a long time. They sat on opposite sides of the room, the space between them filled with the glow of firelight and the low tick of the old clock above the mantel. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't even quiet in a strained way. It just was. A stillness neither of them seemed in a rush to escape. "You get many strangers on horseback around here?" she asked after a while, her voice light. "Can't say I do. Closest thing before you was a deer that wandered into the barn 2 winters back." Kate laughed softly, and Daniel looked up. It was the first time he'd heard it, low, surprised, like it caught her off guard, like it had been a while. She looked over at him, something unreadable in her eyes. "You didn't ask what I was doing out there." "No," he said. "Figured if you wanted to tell me, you would." Kate nodded slowly. "Most people don't wait." "Well," Daniel replied, leaning back in his chair, "I'm not most people." Outside, the storm raged, but in the little house, warmth settled in like a promise. Neither of them knew what would come in the morning, but for tonight, they weren't alone. By morning, the storm had loosened its grip. The howling wind was gone, leaving behind a heavy silence and a world buried in white. Snow blanketed everything in thick, unbroken drifts, softening edges and muting sound. The farmhouse looked like something out of a postcard, if you didn't know how cold it was inside or how thin the walls really were. Daniel stood at the window, steaming mug in hand, watching the first sunlight in days stretch across the field. The sky was pale blue, the kind that only came after a blizzard, like the storm had scrubbed the world clean. He heard the quiet pad of footsteps behind him and turned. Kate stood there, back in her riding clothes, now dry, though still wrinkled from their place by the fire. She looked rested, but there was something else in her expression this morning. A weight, a choice being measured. "I should go," she said, adjusting her gloves. "Thank you. For everything." "You sure?" Daniel asked. "Roads aren't plowed yet. It'll be slow going." "I've been through worse." She offered a wry smile, then glanced around the room once more as if trying to memorize it. He nodded, keeping his thoughts to himself. If she wanted to leave, he wouldn't stop her. But then, as she reached for her coat, she paused. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel looked up from his coffee. "Sure." "This place, the farm, why stay?" she asked. "It's clear you're struggling. You could walk away, sell the land, move into town, start over." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window again, at the barn, the snowdrifts curling around the fences, the fields stretching past the tree line like they always had. "My family's worked this land for 3 generations," he said quietly. "My daughter was born here. My wife's buried just past that hill. I don't know how to walk away from that, even if I could." Kate watched him carefully. Her voice softened. "Is it worth losing everything for?" Daniel met her eyes. Sometimes the fight's what matters more than the outcome. She didn't reply, just nodded slowly as if filing his words away. As Daniel helped her saddle the horse and brush the frost from its mane, he couldn't shake the feeling that something unsaid hung in the air between them. She mounted up, reins in hand, her posture crisp but hesitant. "Good luck, Kate," he said as she turned toward the snow-covered road. She looked back at him once, gaze lingering. "You too, Daniel." Then she was gone. The quiet came back slowly, like dust settling after a long storm. For a day or two, Daniel kept looking up from his work, half expecting to see that dark figure on horseback again, materializing through the trees or waiting at the edge of the road. But no one came. The trail she'd taken had already been swallowed by fresh snow and silence. By the end of the week, it was like she'd never been there at all. The barn still creaked with every gust of wind. The horses still huffed white breath into the cold air as he mucked out stalls and checked frozen water troughs. Ruby nudged his shoulder the same way she always did when she was hungry, and Emily still ran out to meet him every evening after school, her pink coat too big and her scarf trailing behind like a flag. Life didn't stop for strangers, not out here. He split wood until his shoulders ached, patched a broken fence post, and fixed the leak under the kitchen sink with the last of his plumber's tape. Every task was one more thing holding the place together, one more day carved out of the winter, but the bank hadn't forgotten him. Another letter had come, slipped through the mail slot with quiet finality. He hadn't opened it yet. It sat on the counter beneath a chipped coffee mug, waiting like a storm cloud. At night, when the fire had died down, and Emily was tucked into bed with her favorite book, Daniel would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and think about the woman in the storm, Kate. No last name, no reason for being out here beyond the one she hadn't told him. He didn't know if she'd made it home or if she'd ever planned to come back. But the memory of her lingered, like the scent of her tea still faint on the mug she'd used, like the imprint she'd left in Emily's tiny bed. And yet, even with all that, life moved forward. The mornings were cold, the animals needed feeding. The silence was back, and Daniel, same as always, got up and faced the day. The town hall was colder than it should have been, all exposed brick and flickering fluorescence, the kind of place that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Daniel sat in the back row, arms crossed tight over his chest, jaw clenched hard enough to hurt. He hadn't wanted to come. He'd nearly stayed home, figured there wasn't much point in watching them auction off what little was left of his family's legacy. But something about showing up, standing there silent and unbroken, felt necessary. The room wasn't packed, just the usual faces from town. A few ranchers eyeing cheap land, some real estate folks scribbling in notepads, and the bank's rep at the front in a beige suit and an expression that made it clear this was just paperwork to him. Daniel barely heard the opening statements. His eyes were fixed on the floor, heart thudding in his chest like a slow drum. The auction started. A few parcels went first. Empty lots, tools from other farms, some machinery. Then, almost casually, they moved on to his land. His name was read aloud like it didn't mean anything. Parcel 214B, Hayes Property, 27 acres, including one residence, barn, and partial fencing. Starting bid, $40,000. Silence. Then a bid, low, hesitant. A rancher Daniel recognized from 2 towns over. Another bid followed, higher this time. Then another. It crept up slowly back and forth until the room fell quiet again at 55. Daniel stared at the floor, and then a voice spoke from the back, calm, measured, unfamiliar. 120,000. Heads turned. Even the auctioneer blinked. "I'm sorry, did you say?" The voice repeated it. 120. Cash. Daniel turned too, heart stumbling. The woman stood near the back, coat buttoned high, scarf pulled loose at her neck. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed her face. He couldn't quite see her, but something about the shape of her jaw, the stillness in her posture, it struck something deep. The room was silent. No further bids? the auctioneer asked, uncertain now. Going once, twice. The gavel fell. Sold! Daniel's chest tightened, his stomach twisting with disbelief. Whoever she was, she'd just bought his land and saved his home. The knock came just after sundown. Daniel had been elbow-deep in motor oil, working under the hood of an old truck that hadn't run right since autumn. Emily was inside finishing homework, and the house was quiet except for the low hum of the radio in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the stove as it cooled. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the door, expecting a neighbor, maybe someone from town needing help with a dead battery. Instead, he opened the door and found her. Kate. She stood on the porch, not bundled in snow-soaked layers this time, but in a long wool coat and gloves that probably cost more than his month's feed. Her hair was down, caught in the breeze, and her eyes were the same, cool gray-blue, sharp and steady. "Hi, Daniel," she said, quiet but sure. He didn't answer right away, too stunned to find words. "You bought the land," he finally said, voice low. She nodded once. "I did." "You didn't have to, but I wanted to." Silence settled between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Daniel stepped aside, wordlessly inviting her in. She moved past him, her boots tapping gently against the worn floorboards, eyes flicking around the room like she was checking to make sure it hadn't all been a dream. It hadn't changed much. Same coffee mug on the counter, same photo on the mantel. Emily peeked around the hallway, eyes lighting up. "Kate!" Kate smiled and knelt down to greet her, arms open without hesitation. "Hey there, sweetheart." Daniel watched the moment, chest tightening. It felt too good, too easy, like something borrowed. When Emily had gone back to her room, Kate turned to him. "You deserve the truth," she said. "My full name is Catherine Langford." The name landed hard. He knew it. Everyone did. Langford Equestrian, multi-billion-dollar breeding, training, and luxury stables, articles, awards, and empire. "I'm the CEO," she added, as if bracing for the weight of it. Daniel didn't speak for a long time. Finally he asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him, steady. "Because I wanted to know if someone could see me without the title, without the money." Daniel nodded slowly, unreadable. "And did they?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes." The kettle hissed softly on the stove, steam curling into the air like the breath of something alive. Kate stood near the window, arms crossed, her reflection ghosting in the glass as the last light of day slipped behind the trees. Daniel moved slowly through the kitchen, setting 2 chipped mugs on the table, one of them filled with the same tea she'd had the night of the storm. It felt familiar, too familiar. And yet everything had changed. She turned when he sat down, her expression unreadable, but there was a tremble in her hands when she lifted the cup. "I didn't plan to come back," she said quietly. "Not really." Daniel didn't respond, just waited, still steady, the way he always was when he knew someone needed to say something that cost more than pride. "The night of the storm," Kate began, voice distant, "I wasn't just lost in the snow. I was lost, period. My whole life was spreadsheets and boardrooms and contracts written in ink thicker than blood. I used to think success meant winning, owning, controlling everything before it could control me." She paused, eyes flicking to the small picture of Maggie and Emily on the mantel. "But then I ended up here, in your house, eating soup by the fire with a man who didn't ask for anything, who helped a stranger when he had nothing left to give." Daniel looked down at his hands, the faint stains of grease etched into his skin like a permanent badge of work that never stopped. "Didn't seem right to let someone freeze to death on my doorstep." "It wasn't just the kindness," she said. "It was how quiet it was here, honest, like the world had finally stopped spinning long enough for me to breathe." Her voice softened, grew smaller. "I haven't been able to breathe in years." Daniel met her eyes, something gentle moving behind his steady gaze. "So what now?" he asked. She exhaled. "Now I'm trying to figure out who I am without all of it, without the title, without the noise. I came back because this—" She gestured around the kitchen, at the tea, the stove, the quiet. "This is real, and I need real." Daniel nodded slowly, no judgment in his voice. "Well, then," he said, "you're not the only one trying to hold on to what matters." And for the first time in a long while, Kate smiled. Not for show, not out of politeness, for real. The next morning brought a rare kind of calm, the kind that settled over the land like a breath held in quiet anticipation. The sky was clear, a pale sweep of winter blue, and the snow glittered under the early sun. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen smelled of toast and wood smoke, and the rhythm of the day had already begun. Daniel stood at the sink, washing out the mugs from the night before, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Across the table, Kate sat with a notebook open in front of her, pen tapping absently against the page. She'd been quiet all morning, thoughtful but not distant. There was a focus in her eyes that Daniel had come to recognize, the look of someone building something in her mind, piece by piece. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking about your land." Daniel turned off the tap and dried his hands, casting her a cautious glance. "That usually means someone wants to develop it." Kate smirked. "Not quite." He sat across from her, waiting. "I don't want to build condos or cut it up and sell it. I want to build something with you, something that gives back." She flipped the notebook around and slid it toward him. "A sanctuary for rescue horses." Daniel blinked. "You mean like a shelter?" "More than that. A full-scale, sustainable operation, rehabilitation, adoption programs, therapy partnerships. It would give the animals a second chance, and the people too." He looked down at the page. It was sketched out in clean, purposeful lines. Layouts for pastures, barn renovations, solar-powered fencing, a visitor center, all drawn with a kind of precision he wasn't used to seeing on his side of the world. "You'd run it?" he asked slowly. "I'd fund it," she replied. "But it would be yours too, 50-50. We'd make every decision together." Daniel leaned back, arms folded. "Why me?" Kate met his gaze without hesitation. "Because you already do the hard part. You show up. You take care of what's broken. You don't need a title or a press release to do the right thing." He didn't answer right away. The idea was big, maybe too big, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like a dream meant for someone else. "I'll think about it," he said. Kate nodded, smile soft but sure. "That's all I ask." The wind had picked up again by late afternoon, tugging at the corners of the barn roof and sweeping thin drifts of snow across the yard. Daniel stood at the edge of the pasture, one boot propped on the bottom rail of the fence, arms crossed as he watched Ruby and the other horses nosing through what little hay was left in the trough. He should have felt hopeful. Kate's offer was more than generous. It was a lifeline. But all he could feel was the weight of it. Inside the barn, plans were pinned to the wall. Kate's sketches, printed articles, diagrams. She'd even brought a mock-up proposal from her office in the city. It looked polished, clean, like something out of a magazine. It didn't belong in a place where the roof leaked and the tools were older than he was. He rubbed the back of his neck and exhaled, breath fogging in the cold air. Kate was inside the house with Emily, teaching her how to braid a lead rope with strips of old denim. Laughter drifted faintly from the porch, easy, natural, but Daniel couldn't shake the knot that had formed in his chest since she'd shown him the proposal. He'd spent his whole life trying to keep this place standing, scraping by, doing without, patching what couldn't be replaced. It wasn't pretty, but it was his. Every inch of this land had been earned the hard way, with calloused hands and sleepless nights. The idea of someone else, even someone like Kate, coming in, investing, fixing what he hadn't been able to, it stung, like admitting he'd failed. When he heard her steps behind him, he didn't turn. "You're quiet today," she said. "I'm thinking." "About the proposal?" "About what it means," he replied. "To take help like that. To not be the one pulling all the weight anymore." Kate came to stand beside him, her breath visible in the cold. "You'd still be carrying it. I'm just offering to share the load." He was silent for a long moment. "I don't want to lose myself in this," he said finally. "Or this place." "You won't," she answered softly. "Not if we do it together." And though the wind still bit at his coat, and the pasture still looked bare, something in Daniel began to thaw. Not enough to say yes, but maybe enough to stop saying no. The kitchen was warm with the smell of cinnamon and old wood, the kind of comfort that wrapped around you like a blanket. Kate sat at the table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a mixing bowl in front of her and flour dusted lightly on her cheek. She'd insisted on baking cookies with Emily, something normal, she'd said with a smile, and now the two of them were side by side, chatting softly as the oven ticked and glowed. Daniel leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching them with a quiet sort of awe. He couldn't remember the last time the house had felt this alive. Emily was humming as she colored. A bundle of markers and crayons spread across the table like a rainbow exploded. She finished a flourish, bit her lip in concentration, then looked up at Kate with bright, eager eyes. "I made something for you," she said. Kate blinked, surprised. "For me?" Emily nodded and held up a sheet of paper, the drawing a swirl of bold lines and uneven shapes. At the center was a small house with smoke curling from the chimney. Out front, 3 stick figures stood together, a tall man with scruffy hair, a girl with pigtails, and a woman with long dark hair and a big smile. They were holding hands. Kate took the paper carefully, as if it might tear just from being touched. "Is this us?" "Yep," Emily said proudly. "That's you. I made your coat pink because I didn't have gray." Kate's laugh caught in her throat. She stared at the drawing longer than necessary, something soft and shaken in her expression. Daniel stepped closer, catching a glimpse of it over her shoulder. It was innocent, simple, but powerful in a way only children understood. Not just inclusion, belonging. "I love it," Kate said, voice quiet and a little thick. "Thank you, sweetheart." Emily beamed and returned to her coloring, content. Kate looked at Daniel then, and he could see it, that flicker of something she didn't say aloud. The drawing had touched a place inside her that business and boardrooms never reached. And in that moment, pride and hesitation didn't matter so much, not when his daughter had already decided. She was one of them. The sound of hammers echoed through the frosty morning, sharp and rhythmic, cutting through the quiet like a heartbeat. The old barn, weathered by years of storms and neglect, stood with its ribs exposed, wood stripped back, beams being braced, the roof halfway torn off. For the first time in years, it didn't look like it was falling apart. It looked like it was becoming something. Daniel moved with practiced ease, climbing the ladder with a nail gun strapped to his belt and sawdust in his beard. But what struck him most wasn't the work itself. It was who was working beside him. Kate stood in the mud below, sleeves rolled up, a smear of dirt across her cheek and a stubborn curl escaping from under her wool cap. She was holding a support beam steady, boots planted firm in the muck, her eyes locked on the angle he'd told her to keep. Her coat was hanging on a fence post, forgotten. She looked nothing like the polished CEO who had appeared on his porch weeks ago, and he liked her better this way. "You sure you're up for this?" he called down. Kate glanced up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You say that every 10 minutes. I'm not made of glass, Daniel." "No," he said with a grin, "but your manicure might never forgive you." She smirked and adjusted the beam. "Worth it." Emily sat nearby on an overturned bucket, drawing in the dirt with a stick, humming softly to herself. Every so often she'd jump up and carry nails to Kate, proud of her new job. As the morning wore on, the 3 of them worked in rhythm, cutting, lifting, hammering. No fanfare, no entourage, just effort, sweat, and quiet conversations between tasks. Later, while Daniel took a break to fix the generator, Kate stayed behind to sweep the hayloft, dust swirling like gold in the shafts of late light. When he came back, he found her leaning against the open doorway, hair tousled, smile easy. "I was only supposed to be here a day," she said, watching the horses graze below. "Maybe two." Daniel nodded. "What changed?" She didn't look at him when she answered. "You did." The barn creaked gently in the wind, stronger now, steadier, and so was she. By the end of the week, the town had taken notice. It started with the lumber delivery truck pulling into Daniel's drive, twice in one day. Then came the solar fencing supplies, followed by a crew of contractors with clean boots and shiny tools who didn't seem to know how to drink burnt diner coffee or fix a busted axle on the fly. Word travels fast in small places, and Maple Hollow was no different. By Saturday, the feed store had more gossip than grain. "Did you see the woman out there? Works like she's been on a farm her whole life, but those boots? Not from around here." "I heard she's buying up land, some kind of corporate investor." No, she's his cousin, or maybe a lawyer." "Looks like a girlfriend to me." Daniel heard the murmurs everywhere, at the gas station, the hardware store, even in line at the post office. They weren't mean, not exactly, but they carried that small-town edge, the way people looked at you, like you owed them answers they never earned. At first he ignored it. Let folks say what they would. He wasn't in the business of explaining himself. But it got harder when he and Kate walked into Dottie's diner for coffee, and every head turned at once. The bell above the door hadn't even stopped ringing when the room fell into that loaded hush. Forks paused halfway to mouths, eyes flicking back and forth. Kate noticed, of course. She wasn't naive, but she handled it the way she did everything, with straight posture, a calm smile, and an unshakable grace that didn't ask for approval. Daniel ordered 2 coffees and sat at a booth by the window. Kate slid in across from him, removing her gloves one finger at a time. "Your town has opinions," she said lightly. "Always has," he replied, not bothering to deny it. She stirred sugar into her cup, thoughtful. "Let them talk." He looked at her, at the way she fit here without even trying, at how easily she'd slipped into the rhythm of his life without asking permission, and something eased in his chest. "Yeah," he said with a slow nod. "Let them." The thaw came slowly, one day at a time. Icicles dripping from the eaves, the barn roof shedding snow in heavy sheets, and the first green blades of grass daring to peek through the muddy ground. With winter loosening its grip, life on the farm found a new rhythm. The work didn't slow, it never did, but it felt lighter, somehow, like everything was breathing easier. Daniel and Kate often worked late, long after the sun had slipped behind the ridge and the world turned to quiet blue. The kind of hours where the day's edges blur and conversation flows easier than usual. They'd finish chores, check on the horses, then linger, just talking. Sometimes by the wood stove, sometimes leaning against the fence while the stars blinked into view. One night, they sat on the porch steps, 2 mugs of tea steaming between them, and a blanket draped across Kate's lap that had once belonged to Daniel's late wife. She didn't ask about it, he didn't offer, but it was there, and somehow it felt okay. "Did you always want to run a sanctuary?" Daniel asked, his voice low in the hush of evening. Kate smiled softly, staring out at the silhouette of the barn. "No, I used to want to run away." He glanced at her, eyebrows raised. "From the pressure, the money, expectations I never agreed to. I was groomed to take over the Langford Empire before I could even decide who I was. It was like the role was written for me and all I had to do was play along." "And did you?" he asked. "For a long time," she admitted, "until I couldn't anymore." They sat in silence for a few moments, the kind that felt like understanding more than distance. "What about you?" she asked. "Did you always want this life?" Daniel chuckled under his breath. "I didn't plan on it. But after my wife passed, this land was all I had left that still made sense. So I stayed. For Emily. For me." Kate looked at him then, eyes soft. "You're a good man, Daniel." He shrugged, embarrassed. I try. She nudged him gently with her shoulder. You succeed. And for the first time in a long time, they both laughed. Easy, unguarded, and full of something that felt dangerously close to joy. It was late afternoon when the black SUV pulled up the long dirt drive, tires crackling over gravel still damp from spring melt. Daniel had just finished mending a broken gate near the north pasture, his gloves slung into his back pocket and sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He looked up at the unfamiliar vehicle, instantly alert. No one drove that kind of car out here, not unless they were lost or looking for something. The doors opened with a polished ease, and a man stepped out. Tall, crisp, not a speck of mud on his perfectly pressed coat. His shoes gleamed like they'd never touched dirt in their life. He took a long look around the farm, lips tightening with something just shy of contempt, then turned toward the porch. Kate had just come outside, brushing flour off her hands, clearly expecting someone else. The moment her eyes met his, everything changed. Her face went still, utterly still, like a candle snuffed out in one breath. She took a step back before catching herself, shoulders straightening, mouth a tight line. "Thomas," she said, her voice calm but cold. "Kate," the man replied, his tone measured and familiar in that dangerous way. "Didn't think I'd find you playing house on a mud farm." Daniel walked up slowly, keeping a measured distance, but his eyes were fixed on the stranger. "This a friend of yours?" he asked. Kate didn't answer right away. Her hands were clenched at her sides. "This is Thomas Greer," she said finally. "My former fiancé." Thomas's gaze flicked to Daniel, appraising and dismissive all in one look. "So this is where you've been hiding. I thought maybe you'd run off to Europe or bought a vineyard. But a horse farm in the middle of nowhere?" He looked around again with a sneer. "That's beneath you, even for a rebellion." "I didn't come here to rebel," Kate said evenly. "I came here to remember who I am." Thomas stepped closer. "The board is in chaos. Investors are whispering. Your absence is costing millions. You owe people answers." Kate didn't flinch. "I don't owe anyone anything. Not anymore." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through steel. Daniel finally spoke, his voice steady. "You should leave." Thomas looked at him like he hadn't noticed he was standing there. "And who are you?" "The man who's not afraid of a little dirt," Daniel said. "Or of you." Thomas's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. After a long pause, he turned back to Kate. "This isn't over." "No," she replied. "But it's not your decision anymore." And with that, Thomas climbed back into his pristine car and drove away, leaving a trail of dust and history in his wake. The sun had just dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the field when Kate finally opened the envelope Thomas had left behind. It sat untouched on the kitchen table all day, thick, crisp, and bearing the Langford and Greer corporate seal in heavy gold. Daniel had offered to burn it in the stove without looking inside. Kate had almost let him. But now the house was quiet. Emily was asleep upstairs, and Daniel was out checking the perimeter fencing, giving her space without needing to say so. She peeled the seal open carefully, almost absently, like she already knew what was inside. The first page was a printed memo, the kind she used to sign without thinking. Subject: concerns over temporary CEO. Absence from Board of Directors, Langford International Holdings, to Catherine Langford. The tone was professional, sterile even, but every word hit like a judgment. Concerns, investor instability, loss of confidence, questions about her strategic clarity, and personal distractions. Her absence, they claimed, was not in keeping with the long-term vision of the company. The implication was sharp as a blade. If she didn't return soon and resume control, they would consider their options. Kate's hands tightened around the paper. The next few pages were reports, projections, contingency plans. One even included a breakdown of potential leadership replacements. Thomas's name was circled. Of course it was. She pushed back from the table and stood, pacing the length of the kitchen. The house felt too small suddenly, the walls too close. Out here, she'd finally found a place where she could breathe, but now the pressure she thought she'd left behind had caught up with her. The board wasn't just nervous, they were circling. She gripped the edge of the counter and stared out the window, where Daniel was a shadow against the soft light, moving slowly along the fence line with a lantern in hand. He had no idea what kind of storm was coming. Part of her wanted to run again, to disappear before this world collided with his. But another part, stronger, steadier, wanted to stand her ground, not as the CEO, not as the billionaire, but as Kate. And that part wasn't ready to leave. The spring wind carried a faint chill, but the fields were finally waking up, soft with green, rich with promise. The horses grazed in the upper pasture, the barn repairs were nearly done, and the sanctuary Kate envisioned was starting to take shape, not just on paper but in wood and sweat and soil. But something had shifted between them. Daniel felt it every time she picked up her phone and stepped outside to take a call. Every time a black SUV rolled up with supplies or someone in a suit asked for her by name. It was like the quiet they'd built together was being chipped away, one polished intrusion at a time. He kept busy, busier than necessary, fixing fence posts that didn't need fixing, rechecking the grain order, cleaning tools twice, anything to keep his hands moving and his thoughts from catching up. When Kate came out to the barn with 2 coffees in hand, he barely looked up from where he was replacing a latch on the stall door. "I brought you one," she said gently, holding out the cup. "Thanks," he muttered, taking it but not meeting her eyes. She waited, leaning against the opposite stall. "Daniel, we need to talk." "About what?" he said, though he already knew. "About what's happening. About the board, the pressure, the way you've been." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Pulling back." He stood slowly, wiped his hands on a rag. "I'm not pulling back. I'm working." "Daniel." He sighed, finally looking at her. "You said this was supposed to be real, simple, and for a while it was. But now there are meetings, phone calls, men in tailored suits asking about permits and expansion plans. That's not the life I signed up for." "I never asked you to sign up for anything," she said softly. "Exactly," he snapped before he could stop himself. "Because you can walk away, back to your boardroom, back to your world. I don't get that choice, Kate. I've got this land, this kid, and a life that doesn't stretch far enough to make room for empire building." Her face tightened. "Is that what you think this is? Just me playing charity? I think you're from a world that chews people like me up and doesn't look back." Kate didn't answer right away, and when she did, her voice was low. "Then maybe you don't know me at all." She turned and walked out, the barn door swinging shut behind her. Daniel stood there in the silence, heart pounding, already regretting the walls he'd just started to rebuild. The morning of Emily's 8th birthday broke with a sky full of sun, gentle, warm, and cloudless, as if even the weather knew it was a day worth celebrating. The farm buzzed with quiet activity, but Daniel didn't notice at first. He'd been too wrapped in his own thoughts lately. Ever since that argument in the barn, he and Kate had been like 2 people walking the same path, but not speaking the same language. He'd barely spoken to her in 2 days, even as she continued working, organizing, helping where she could. But that morning, something was different. Emily came down the stairs to find a pink ribbon tied to the banister and a trail of colorful paper hearts leading out the front door. She followed them barefoot, laughing, calling for her dad. Daniel, still in the kitchen sipping coffee, looked up when he heard her shriek of delight. Outside, strung between the barn and the old oak tree, were handmade streamers and balloons that bobbed in the breeze. A folding table was set up with a stack of wrapped presents, all neatly labeled with Emily's name. A small cake sat beneath a glass dome, chocolate with strawberry frosting, her favorite. And standing beside it all, brushing flour off her jeans, was Kate. She met Daniel's stunned expression with a tentative smile. "Hope you don't mind. She told me last week she's never had a real party. I figured, why not?" Daniel stepped outside, heart tight in his chest, as he watched Emily bounce from decoration to decoration, her laughter lifting into the morning like bird song. He hadn't seen her this happy in months, maybe years. "She said she didn't want anything," he murmured. "She didn't ask for anything," Kate said gently. "There's a difference." They stood side by side for a moment, watching Emily tear into a gift with both hands, some art supplies and a new set of boots. The joy on her face was real, unfiltered. "I didn't mean what I said," Daniel said quietly, eyes still on his daughter. "Not all of it." Kate looked at him, softening. "I know." He turned to her, a flicker of something breaking through the pride and regret. "Thank you for giving her this." Kate's eyes glistened just slightly. "You've given her everything. I just tied a few ribbons." In the quiet that followed, Daniel felt something shift, not just between them, but inside him. Because in that moment, surrounded by laughter and color and possibility, he remembered that even here, even now, joy was still possible. And it had come wrapped in a pink ribbon. The rain came fast and hard, a sudden spring downpour that turned the dirt paths into mud and drummed against the barn roof like angry fingers. Daniel was hauling a tarp over the feed pile when he saw Kate coming across the yard, her coat already soaked, hair plastered to her cheeks. She moved with purpose, no umbrella, no hesitation. He knew that look. "Daniel," she called, her voice sharp above the storm. He sighed, straightened, and met her halfway between the barn and the porch. Rain ran in rivulets down his neck, pooling in the folds of his shirt, but neither of them seemed to notice. "I got a call from the zoning office this morning," she said, words clipped. "They're holding the permits for the sanctuary. You never filed the updated plans." He crossed his arms, jaw tight. "I was going to, when I was sure." "Sure of what?" she snapped, eyes narrowing. "That I wouldn't run off and leave you? That this isn't just another rich girl project?" Daniel didn't answer right away. The rain hammered down harder, soaking them both to the bone. "You're trying to build something that doesn't belong here," he said finally, voice low but steady. "You come in with your big ideas, your clean money, and think you can just fix what's broken like it's a business pitch, but this isn't a company, Kate. It's my life." She stepped closer, her expression tight with hurt. "And what about my life, Daniel? Do you think I came here just to play charity case? Do you honestly believe I'd stay through the mud and the storms and the silence if I didn't care about this? About you?" His eyes flicked away. "You don't understand what it's like to lose everything." She blinked like he'd slapped her. "I've lost things you'll never know," she said, voice trembling now, not from the cold. "I walked away from a life people would kill for because it felt hollow, because this place, you, Emily, it finally felt real, but you keep shutting me out like I'm some threat you need to manage." Daniel didn't know what to say. The words were caught behind a dam of fear, of pride, of every scar he hadn't let her see. Kate took a step back, rain dripping from her eyelashes. "You don't have to trust my money, Daniel, but I thought you'd trust me." And with that she turned and walked away, her boots sinking in the mud with every step. Daniel stood there alone, the storm soaking through more than just his skin. The morning dawned gray and muted, the storm having passed but leaving behind the kind of hush that settles deep into the bones. Rain still dripped from the gutters, tapping against the porch with a steady, hollow rhythm. The air was heavy, still thick with yesterday. Daniel woke early, unrested and uneasy, a knot lodged in his chest that sleep hadn't unraveled. He pushed himself out of bed and moved through the house on instinct. Boots on, coffee brewing, the motions of routine holding him together. But something felt off, too quiet. He checked Emily's room first. She was still curled beneath her covers, her soft breathing even, her stuffed bear tucked beneath her arm. He let the door close gently behind him and stepped toward the guest room. Empty. The quilt was folded, the bed made. Her duffel bag, gone. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment, the silence ringing louder than it should have. He stepped inside, looking for a note, a scribbled message, a clue. Nothing. He moved to the kitchen. No teacup in the sink, no boots by the door. Her coat, once hanging next to his on the hook, was gone. Even the drawing Emily had made, the one Kate had tucked beside her things, had vanished with her. Just gone. He stepped outside, scanning the yard. The mud still bore the marks of her tires, now drying into hardened tracks that curved toward the road and disappeared into the distance. The place felt colder without her, as if even the land noticed something had been pulled from it. Daniel sat on the porch steps, coffee forgotten in his hand, rainwater soaking into the worn wood beneath him. The fight from the day before echoed in his mind, his words sharp, hers wounded. Pride had spoken louder than truth. Fear had closed the door before she even had a chance to knock. She hadn't slammed the door when she left. She'd simply walked away, and that somehow was worse. The city greeted her with indifference. New York was the same as it had always been, fast, loud, and ruthlessly efficient. The black car that picked Kate up from the airstrip didn't ask questions. Her penthouse hadn't changed. The marble floors still gleamed, the windows still stretched floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of steel and glass. But none of it felt like home, not anymore. She dropped her bag just inside the door and stood in silence, the hum of the building's HVAC the only sound. The air smelled of expensive emptiness, designer candles and polished wood, but no earth, no hay, no smoke curling from a wood stove, no Emily's laughter, no quiet footsteps overhead, no Daniel. Kate exhaled and headed straight for the boardroom. Langford Holdings occupied an entire floor downtown. Her name was still on the glass, etched in silver, but the looks that greeted her when she stepped through the doors were no longer warm. There was surprise, hesitation, calculated politeness, the kind that comes right before the knife. Thomas was already in the conference room, leaning back in her old chair like he'd never left it. The rest of the board sat around the table, legal folders open, laptops glowing. "Nice of you to join us," he said smoothly. Kate didn't sit. She looked around the room and saw what she'd missed while she was gone, shifts in loyalty, quiet power plays, the subtle erosion of what had once been hers. "We reviewed your proposal," said one of the board members, "the sanctuary, the funding, the pivot to philanthropy." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Kate squared her shoulders. "Langford Holdings was built on horses, on compassion. That sanctuary is a return to our roots." Thomas stood, expression cold. "It's not a business, it's a distraction, and while you were off playing farmer, the company moved on." She felt the weight of it hit, not just betrayal, but erasure. These were the people who had once nodded at every word she said. Now they barely looked at her. The vote was inevitable. She left the building with her chin high and her name still technically on the door, but the power behind it gone. Stripped not by force, but by distance, by choosing something other than ambition. That night, back in the echoing silence of her penthouse, Kate sat on the floor, heels kicked off, hair unpinned, and stared at the untouched city beyond the glass. All the wealth, all the power, all the people calling her brilliant, and not a single one who really knew her, not like he did. The barn was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that only came after a long day of rain and reflection. Daniel moved through it slowly, checking feed bins, brushing Ruby down, anything to keep his hands busy. The ache of Kate's absence had settled into something heavier than regret, something that lived behind his ribs like a second heartbeat. He hadn't spoken much since she left, not to Emily, not to the neighbors, not even to himself. The farm was quieter without her laughter in the mornings, without the half-finished mug of tea left on the porch rail, without the soft sound of her boots crossing the floor at night. As he reached for an old feed bucket tucked in the corner of the tack room, something slipped out from behind it, A folded piece of paper, slightly creased and worn at the edges. Daniel froze, frowning, and bent to pick it up. It wasn't just any paper. It was Kate's stationery, the soft ivory kind, embossed in the corner with her initials. His name was written on the front. Just that. Daniel. He hesitated before opening it, thumb tracing over the loop of the D. She must have written it before she left. Maybe she'd meant to give it to him. Maybe she couldn't. He unfolded the letter slowly. Daniel, I don't know if I'll find the right words, but I need to try. Maybe you'll never read this. Maybe I won't be brave enough to leave it where you'll find it. But I have to try anyway. The truth is, I didn't come to your farm looking for anything. I was just running. Again. I've spent my whole life in boardrooms full of people who smile at me with empty eyes. People who nod when they're told to. I've built an empire and lost myself in the process. And then you opened your door to me. No questions, no judgment, just kindness. And that changed everything. You reminded me that trust isn't something you buy. It's something you earn. That love isn't about perfection or control or what the world sees. It's about presence, stillness. The way you look at your daughter, the way you touch the earth like it matters. I think I fell in love with you in the quiet. And I think you felt something too, even if you're too stubborn to say it. If you're reading this, I hope it means I was wrong to leave without goodbye. But if I'm not there, just know that I never really left. Not in the ways that matter. Kate. Daniel stood there a long time, the letter trembling in his hand, his heart thudding, like hooves on frozen ground. She hadn't just been passing through, she'd been trying to stay. The letter sat folded neatly on the dash, weighted down by Daniel's calloused hand as the old truck rumbled down the two-lane highway. The tires hummed over the asphalt like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. Fields gave way to towns, towns to cities. And by late morning, Daniel found himself staring up at a skyline that swallowed the sky whole. New York City was louder than he'd imagined, bigger, impatient. It moved with the urgency of people who didn't look twice, didn't pause long enough to ask your name. The buildings stretched like monuments to ambition, steel and glass, catching the sun in hard angles. His truck looked like it didn't belong. He knew how it felt. He parked 2 blocks from the towering Langford International building, the one he'd only ever seen on news articles and magazine covers. Now he stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, boots still dusted with the dirt of his land. Tourists passed. A doorman gave him a quick once-over, then politely pretended not to see him. Inside it was all marble and marble silence. Daniel stepped up to the front desk, throat dry. "I'm here to see Kate. Catherine Langford." The receptionist didn't even blink. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Sir, she doesn't take walk-ins." "She'll want to see me." There must have been something in his voice, steady, unwavering, that made the woman hesitate. She picked up the phone. Upstairs, the boardroom was mid-meeting. The air was stale with power plays and passive-aggressive smiles. Kate sat at the far end, trying to keep her focus as Thomas outlined a strategic pivot she'd seen coming a mile away. Then the door opened. "Miss Langford," the assistant whispered, "there's someone here to see you. He wouldn't leave." Kate stood before she realized she was moving. "Who?" The assistant just stepped aside, and there he was, Daniel Hayes, standing in the heart of her empire like he'd walked off the cover of a different life. Flannel shirt, work boots, a folded letter clutched in one hand. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her with the kind of honesty you couldn't fake. "I read it," he said finally, voice low and rough. The room behind her disappeared. The table, the board, even Thomas, who sat frozen in disbelief. Kate took one breath, then another, and smiled. The boardroom had never felt smaller. Kate stood at the head of the table, her usual poise intact, but her heart thudding like it hadn't in years. Daniel stood beside her, hands bare, letter gone, left in her office where she'd read it again with trembling fingers. Now he faced a dozen of the most powerful people in the equestrian world, all of them staring at him like he'd wandered in from another planet. Maybe he had, but he didn't blink. "I'm not here to impress you," Daniel began, voice steady but unpolished. "I'm not a businessman. I don't have a PowerPoint, and I don't speak your language. But I know something you don't." Thomas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "And what's that?" Daniel looked around the room, meeting every gaze. "I know what it's like to care about something when there's no profit in it. I know what it's like to stay up at night wondering how you'll feed the horses, how you'll keep the roof from caving in, how you'll explain to your daughter that the world isn't fair, but that you still have to show up anyway." He paused, letting the silence settle. "You all think the sanctuary Kate wants is charity, a soft story, a distraction." He looked to Kate, and something unspoken passed between them, shared truth, raw and real. "But it's not. It's a chance, a real one, for your brand, for your name, for your legacy. You build this sanctuary and it tells the world you still care about the animals, the people, the roots this company came from. And yeah, it might not make millions overnight, but it'll matter. And people are looking for that now. They're starving for it." He stepped back. No theatrics, no pitch deck, just the truth. Kate turned to the board, her voice calm and certain. "I built this company from the ground up, but I forgot what ground felt like. Daniel reminded me." The room was silent. One board member cleared her throat, nodded once. Another followed, then another. Thomas didn't say a word. The vote passed. Not because of strategy, but because sometimes authenticity is louder than money. And Daniel Hayes had just reminded them all how to listen. The town looked the same as she remembered it. Quiet roads lined with budding trees, fields greening under a pale spring sky, and the worn wooden sign that welcomed her back to Maplewood as if she'd never left. Kate rolled down the window of her rented pickup, letting the breeze tangle through her hair. No tinted glass, no chauffeur, no conference calls waiting in her ear. Just the hum of tires on familiar dirt and the kind of silence that felt like a homecoming. The farmhouse came into view slowly, rising over the crest of the hill like a memory come to life. The barn was almost finished now. Clean lines, new roof, fresh paint where the old had peeled. Horses moved through the pasture with quiet grace, and the scent of wood smoke drifted faintly through the air. She parked near the gate and stepped out, boots crunching against gravel. No one greeted her right away, but she didn't mind. She wanted the moment to stretch, to breathe. Daniel emerged from the barn with a hay bale balanced on his shoulder, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, his movements instinctual and unhurried. He froze when he saw her, just for a second. Then he set the bale down and walked toward her. Kate smiled, unsure of what to say first. "I resigned," she said finally. Daniel raised a brow. "Just like that?" No press release, no drama, just a pen, a signature, and a boardroom full of shocked faces. "And the empire?" She shrugged. "Still standing. It's theirs now. I've got different ground to stand on." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You sure about this?" Kate stepped closer, eyes never leaving his. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." From the porch, Emily burst through the screen door, her voice rising in a cheerful squeal. "Kate?" She ran straight into Kate's arms, nearly knocking her off balance. Kate laughed, holding her tight, eyes damp. Daniel watched them, this woman, this child, this life he'd once thought too fragile to hope for, and felt the wall around his heart settle, not crumble, but become something softer. Kate wasn't back as the CEO. She was back as herself, and this time she wasn't leaving. It happened just before dawn. The sky was still wrapped in blue-gray mist when Daniel heard the soft, urgent nickering from the barn. He was already half awake. Years of farm life had tuned his body to the rhythms of the land, and by the time his boots hit the floor, Kate was already slipping on a hoodie beside him. "It's her," she said quietly, eyes wide with hope. "It's time." They didn't have to say the mare's name. Clementine, the rescued thoroughbred with the scarred leg and haunted eyes, had arrived at the sanctuary months earlier, broken in body and spirit. They'd nursed her back slowly, carefully, never expecting she'd come with a secret. But the vet confirmed it a few weeks in. Clementine was pregnant, due in the spring, and spring had come. The barn was warm with lantern light and the scent of fresh hay. Clementine stood in her stall, breathing heavily, her sides heaving, eyes wide but calm. Daniel opened the gate slowly, whispering to her as Kate knelt by her side, hands steady, voice low and soothing. Hours passed in a blur of breath and tension, the world outside fading to silence. Then, just as the first streaks of gold lit the sky through the slats in the barn wall, it happened. A soft, wet rustle, a final groan, and then the cry of something brand new. The foal was small, delicate, legs folding like reeds as it collapsed gently onto the straw. Clementine turned toward it, nuzzling softly, and the room exhaled all at once. Kate had tears in her eyes. Daniel was quiet, watching the scene like something sacred. "She made it," Kate whispered. "They both did." He looked at her, at the way her hand rested on the mare's neck, at the light in her eyes, the awe on her face. "So did you." They didn't need to say what it meant, that this foal was more than just a new beginning for a rescued horse. It was a symbol of survival, of second chances, of what could be born from something once thought broken. Outside, the first birds began to sing, and inside the barn, life, real and raw and beautiful, had just begun. By late spring, the farm no longer felt like a place barely holding on. It felt alive. Fences stood straight and strong. The barn gleamed with fresh red paint, the scent of cedar still lingering in the air. Pastures stretched wide and green, dotted with grazing horses, each with their own story, rescued, rehabilitated, and reborn. What had once been Daniel's solitary fight to survive had grown into something shared, something hopeful, something whole. Kate walked the fields with a clipboard in one hand and dirt on her jeans, laughing as Emily raced past her with a bucket full of grain. She wasn't a guest anymore. She wasn't a billionaire passing through. She was part of the land now, her boots just as muddy as Daniel's, her hands just as calloused. And her heart, well, that was the one thing she'd never held back again. They worked side by side every day, and each night brought its own quiet rituals. Dinner on the porch, stories by lantern light, a slow dance beneath the stars with no music but the breeze and the crickets. They didn't rush it. There was no need. What they had was steady, built one brick at a time, like the sanctuary itself. Kate had donated her stake in Langford Holdings to a nonprofit board and turned the rest of her attention to the farm. Daniel had reluctantly agreed to expand the operation, carefully, slowly, with her by his side. The paperwork called them co-directors of the Maplewood Equine Sanctuary, but everyone else just called them partners. One afternoon, as they leaned against the fence watching Clementine and her foal trotting circles in the paddock, Kate handed Daniel a folded piece of paper. He opened it and saw the new sanctuary logo, her initials no longer stamped in gold, but a small sketch of the barn with a foal beside it. "You drew this?" he asked. She nodded. "I wanted something simple, something real." He looked at her, at the life they'd built from ruin and rain and risk, and smiled. "It's perfect." Kate reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, without a word. From two strangers caught in a storm, to partners rebuilding something that mattered. It wasn't just a farm anymore, it was home. The sun hung high over Maplewood, casting a warm glow across the sanctuary fields as laughter and music filled the air. Folding chairs dotted the lawn, hay bales had been stacked into makeshift benches, and string lights stretched from the barn to the old oak tree, swaying gently in the breeze. Horses grazed contentedly in the distance, the land lush and green, thriving in a way Daniel never could have imagined just 1 year ago. Emily raced through the crowd, a clipboard tucked under her arm and a handmade volunteer leader badge pinned proudly to her shirt. She waved at guests, handed out flyers, and occasionally stopped to show off the foal, now almost grown, who had become the sanctuary's quiet mascot. Near the barn, Daniel stood with a glass of lemonade in one hand, his other resting casually in his pocket as he watched it all unfold. The fundraiser had drawn more people than he'd expected. Local families, donors from out of town, even a few of Kate's old connections from the city. They came not for business, but because they believed in what had been built here, because they believed in her. Kate was in her element, smiling as she greeted guests, boots dusty, hair pulled into a loose braid. No heels, no title, just Kate Langford, co-founder of the Maplewood Equine Sanctuary, partner, mother figure, and the heart behind the work. She caught Daniel's eye across the yard and crossed over to him slowly, her fingers brushing his as she joined him at the fence line. "Think we made a difference?" she asked, her voice quiet beneath the hum of music. He looked out at the pasture, at the crowd gathered under the wide sky, at Emily chatting with a group of volunteers as if she owned the place. "I think we made a home," he said. Kate leaned into his shoulder, content. The storm that brought her to him was long past now, but it had never really left them, not in the way it mattered. It had shaped them, cracked them open, cleared a space where something real could grow. They had been strangers once. Now they were family, and in the storm's wake they had found forever.